You know, when people ask, why would the United States back Pakistan over India, especially in 2025, when India seems to be the rising democratic superpower, they're asking a question that seems intuitive, but it's actually deceptively simple. What they're really confronting is the complex and often unsettling reality of international strategy. It's not about who's right. It's not even necessarily about who's better. It's about who's useful, and more precisely, useful now. You have to understand something about great powers. They don't act based on sentimentality. They act based on necessity, and necessity, in this case, is dictated by a rapidly shifting global order. The rise of China is not hypothetical anymore, it's actualized, concrete, and aggressive. The Belt and Road Initiative is no longer a project, it's infrastructure in place, naval bases, trade routes, digital surveillance nodes. It's a new empire being built right in front of us, and so the U.S. faces a question it hasn't had to ask seriously in decades. Who helps us contain this? And here's where Pakistan comes incontroversial, unstable, often criticized, but undeniably positioned at the strategic crossroads between East and West, between China and the Islamic world, between military volatility and ideological influence. Pakistan has become less of a liability and more of a lever. Its geography alone makes it a keystone player in any plan to counter China's western expansion. You can't monitor Xinjiang or the Belt and Road Corridor without going through Islamabad. You can't influence Kabul without their buy-in. These are realities, not theories. So now the United States is making a cold calculation. They're saying India is too independent. India wants multipolarity. India won't play subordinate in our vision of world order. And to some extent, they're right. India under Modi has emphasized sovereignty, cultural resurgence, and non-alignment. That's admirable in many respects. It shows strength, tradition, purpose. But it also means India won't always say yes to the West's plans, and in geopolitics, when you need cooperation, hesitation is a risk. Now compare that with Pakistan, a nation that, though turbulent, is willing to negotiate, willing to accept conditions in return for support. It's not about shared values, it's about predictable leverage. You're not trying to make a friend, you're trying to secure a strategic position on the board. In chess, you don't always protect the most powerful piece. You protect the piece that defends your flank. And right now, Pakistan is the bishop guarding the king's side, while the queen's gambit plays out in the Pacific. And there's a psychological element to all of this too. The West often falls into the trap of thinking the world wants to be just like it, liberal, open, rational. But that's not how most nations think. Most nations think in terms of survival, pride, territory, honor. They think in stories, in historical grievances, in collective identity. And when you view American decisions through that lens, you start to see a pattern. The U.S. isn't choosing between good and evil, it's choosing between manageable and unmanageable risk. So when you hear that the U.S. is backing Pakistan more than India in this moment, don't just react with outrage or confusion. Ask instead, what does this reveal about the underlying assumptions of global power? What does it tell us about how nations perceive threats, loyalty, and control? And, most importantly, what kind of world are we building when alliances are no longer based on principle, but on proximity and pliability? Because here's the bitter truth, when strategy replaces values, stability becomes temporary. And if you're not careful, the alliances you build to win today become the enemies you face tomorrow. Let that sink in. Let's talk a bit about intelligence, military partnerships, and why they often seem to contradict our professed moral values. Because if you're trying to understand why the United States is supporting Pakistan over India in 2025, you can't ignore this part of the puzzle. It's not a footnote. It's central to the story. People often forget that trust in the intelligence world isn't about ethics. It's about predictability. It's about how closely you can bind another nation to your own interests without them pulling away at the critical moment. Now, Pakistan has had a long, complicated, and often strained relationship with the U.S., but it's also one of deep entanglement. Shared intelligence operations, drone warfare coordination, counter-terrorism networks, all of these things create a kind of bureaucratic inertia. Once you build those systems, it becomes very difficult to unwind them. That's not a weakness, that's by design. It's like in psychology when you form a trauma bond. Not healthy necessarily, but strong. In this case, the bond between Washington and Islamabad has been forged in the crucible of necessity. Terrorism, Taliban resurgences, nuclear deterrence, regional chaos. These are not optional challenges. And when the stakes are high enough, you don't always pick your partner. You cling to whoever's in the room who knows how to work the levers. India, on the other hand, doesn't operate in that framework. It doesn't want to be part of the machine. It wants to build its own. It has its own intelligence architecture. It plays the long game. It deals with Russia. It talks to Iran. It has relationships with the Gulf states that don't run through Washington. That's admirable in a way. It shows strength, vision, self-respect. But to the American intelligence community, it's also a signal. This partner won't follow your lead. They'll walk beside you but not behind you, and that means they're not fully inside the tent. Now Pakistan's military establishment is deeply entrenched in its own political life, and that's a tragedy in many ways. But it's also what makes them such a reliable conduit for American interests. You're not dealing with fragmented bureaucracy. You're dealing with a consolidated power base that knows how to maintain order, at least from the Western perspective. When Washington needs a favor, monitoring movement on the Afghan border, running a black site facility, opening back channels with tribal leaders, it picks up the phone and calls Rawalpindi, not New Delhi. That should tell you something. In geopolitics, the measure of a partnership isn't how aligned your values are. It's how quickly you respond when asked. This is a hard lesson, especially for those who believe that democracy and transparency are the natural foundation of every international alliance. But the reality is more primitive, more Hobbesian. Alliances are built not on shared dreams, but on shared threats. And here's the deeper psychological truth. People, and by extension nations, will always prioritize survival over integrity when they feel threatened. That's not cynicism, that's realism. It's the fundamental moral tension of power. The West says it wants allies who share its ideals, but when the fire gets hot, it turns to those who already know how to operate in the shadows. So if you're wondering why the U.S. is doubling down on Pakistan instead of investing fully in India, you need to ask a darker, more uncomfortable question. When everything goes wrong, who do you trust to do what needs to be done, without asking too many questions? And that answer right now is Pakistan. We may not like the implications of that, but until we create a world where integrity and utility are the same thing, we'll keep choosing what works over what's right. And if that doesn't trouble you, it should. You know, when people talk about alliances, especially between great powers, they like to imagine harmony, shared values, mutual respect, a kind of idealized cooperation where everyone moves in sync toward a common future. But that's not how these relationships work, not in the real world. What we're seeing in 2025 is not a collapse of the U.S.-India relationship, but a growing dissonance, a kind of subtle divergence of purpose. And that matters more than most people realize. India is not a client state. It never has been. And it's not trying to become the West's next great ally in the way Washington often imagines. India's identity, its political culture, its spiritual traditions, its history of colonization and resistance, has forged a nation that resists external influence on a deep psychological level. And that resistance isn't aggression, it's memory. collective memory, a memory that whispers, never let another empire write your story again. Now, that makes India admirable in a certain sense, itself, defining, proud, independent, but it also makes India difficult to manage from a Western strategic standpoint. Because what America often wants in a partner, particularly in high-stakes international maneuvering, is alignment, not just ideological but practical. They want a country that will echo its messaging, support its sanctions, integrate with its military systems, and, perhaps most importantly, play within its media and diplomatic framework. And India has shown, especially in recent years, that it will not always do that. Whether it's buying oil from Russia despite U.S. pressure, pushing back on Western narratives around internal politics, or simply refusing to fall in line with global campaigns, India has signaled something very clear: it's charting its own course. This makes it both valuable and threatening to American planners. Valuable because it's powerful, technologically rising, and regionally influential. Threatening because it can't be counted on to toe the line. And in a moment of increasing global instability, unpredictability, even from a friend, can look like defiance. Pakistan, by contrast, is far more aligned, not ideologically, but behaviorally. It's used to dealing with American military demands. It understands how to operate within Washington's framework. It knows how to accept conditional funding, to play the game of diplomatic reciprocity, and perhaps most importantly, it rarely says no outright. That doesn't mean it's more loyal, but it's more pliable, and that counts for a lot in the corridors of realpolitik. Now, what's interesting, if you're paying attention, is the growing philosophical gap between the West and India. The U.S. often tries to promote individualism, liberalism, and globalist ideals. India, by contrast, is embracing tradition, collective identity, national pride, and a civilizational ethos that's older than the Western concept of the modern state itself. That's not just a political disagreement, it's a cultural and psychological one, and that creates friction. Because the West increasingly sees India not as a stable extension of its values, but as a rising power with its own agenda, one that cannot be easily absorbed into the existing global hierarchy. That's the challenge. When your supposed ally begins to see itself not as a participant in your vision, but as a competitor to it, then the relationship becomes strained, quietly, subtly, but undeniably. So the question isn't just why is the U.S. supporting Pakistan more in 2025. The deeper question is why is India no longer playing the role America expected it to play? And the answer is simple: because it never agreed to. Here's the truth most people don't want to say out loud. India doesn't want to be the West's mirror. It wants to be its own light. And if the West refuses to accept that, it may find itself alienating one of the most important civilizations of the 21st century, not because of hostility, but because of an inability to accept true independence. And that's the kind of blindness history doesn't forgive. When people think about international power, they often imagine it as a matter of strength. Who has the most weapons, the biggest economy, the largest population? But influence doesn't always come from dominance. Often it comes from proximity, from being close, geographically, culturally, psychologically, to the source of chaos, and Pakistan, perhaps more than any other U.S. ally, exists right on the edge of that chaos. Now consider the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. That decision was historic, yes, but it wasn't clean. It left behind a vacuum, military, political, ideological. And that vacuum didn't just evaporate, it shifted. It moved outward, rippling into Central Asia, into the tribal borderlands, into the intelligence networks that had been carefully constructed over 2 decades of war. And the one country left holding the map, the access points, the relationships, was Pakistan. This is important because the West doesn't have the infrastructure to manage Afghanistan anymore. The embassies are gone. The bases are dismantled, the translators are scattered, and the intelligence pipelines that once connected Kabul to Washington now run cold. But Pakistan never left. It's still there watching, trading, negotiating, listening. Its military and intelligence services have deep, often controversial ties to factions within Afghanistan. And while that creates its own set of moral complications, it also creates leverage. Now, from a strategic standpoint, the U.S. needs access to that region. It's not a matter of choice, it's a matter of long-term necessity. Central Asia is the corridor between China, Russia, Iran, and the broader Islamic world. It's the heartland of the new great game, the place where ideologies collide and proxy wars begin. And without a foothold there, the West is flying blind. This is where Pakistan becomes more than just a state. It becomes a gateway, a conduit, a kind of dark mirror through which the West can still observe and intervene without getting its hands fully dirty. That's a psychologically uncomfortable truth, but it's true nonetheless. If you want access to Kabul, to the tribal areas, to the covert dynamics of this volatile region, you don't call India, you call Islamabad. And that's not because Pakistan is more ethical or more reliable in the traditional sense. It's because they understand the terrain, both physical and psychological. They speak the languages, they understand the codes. They know which doors to knock on in the middle of the night, and which to avoid at all costs. In many ways, they operate on a different moral register, one shaped less by Western liberalism and more by survival, by tribal loyalty, by historical grievance. From a Western lens that can look dangerous, but from a strategic lens, it's indispensable. So when you see the U.S. continuing to funnel support into Pakistan, despite its history of duplicity, despite its instability, despite its ideological ambiguity, you have to look beyond the headlines. You have to ask, where else would they turn? Who else can offer that level of embedded access into a region so opaque and volatile? India, for all its strength, doesn't touch Afghanistan. It doesn't have the same leverage in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, or the Taliban's backroom circles. It's a rising power, yes, but it's a distant one in this context. Pakistan, for better or worse, is in the room where it happens, and this reveals something profound about the nature of alliances. They are not always about trust. Sometimes they are about necessity, and necessity doesn't care about ideals. It cares about results. So here's the question you should really be asking. When your values and your survival are in conflict, which one do you protect first? Because the answer to that question will determine not only who you align with, but who you become. Let's take a step back now, not from strategy or geopolitics, but from perception. Because perception, in many ways, is more powerful than fact. We live in a world shaped not by raw information, but by the stories we tell about that information, and this is especially true in the West, where media and narrative form the psychological scaffolding of public opinion and, by extension, foreign policy. The United States is not just a military power or an economic hegemon. It is a narrative machine. It exports meaning. It constructs moral frameworks that help justify its actions, and it reinforces those frameworks through media, academia, and diplomacy. Now, I'm not saying that's all propaganda. There's truth in it, to be sure, but it's still a kind of lens, and that lens doesn't always reflect reality. Sometimes it distorts it. India, despite being the world's largest democracy, often struggles to fit into that lens. It doesn't quite conform to Western ideals of liberal governance. It asserts national pride unapologetically. It doesn't shy away from religion in public life, and it pushes back hard against Western critiques, particularly when those critiques come wrapped in moral superiority. That makes India, in the Western media ecosystem, a complex and often uncomfortable ally. Not because it's doing something objectively wrong, but because it doesn't easily play the part assigned to it in the broader Western narrative. Pakistan, by contrast, has mastered the game of perception. Despite its political instability, its military dominance over civilian institutions, and a long record of internal repression, it has learned how to position itself as a necessary partner, a victim of terrorism, a frontline state, a misunderstood player, and more importantly, it has leveraged Western guilt about colonialism, about Islamophobia, about failed wars, to keep the sympathy of key power brokers alive. In a world obsessed with optics, that's not a side story. That's the main act, and let's be honest, there's also a psychological dynamic at play here, rooted in what Carl Jung would call the shadow. The West often sees in India a mirror of its own contradictions: inequality, nationalism, rising populism, and the return of ancient traditions that challenge the narrative of progress. That makes India less comforting. Pakistan, by comparison, becomes a place where the West can project its own narratives without confrontation. It's a place where the old paternalism of foreign policy, the idea that we're helping a struggling partner, still functions. This is subtle, but it's profound. When a nation is perceived as confident, capable, and self-directing, as India increasingly is, it becomes harder for the West to feel useful, to feel needed. But when a nation appears fragile, dependent, or volatile, the impulse to intervene, support, or even manipulate is much stronger. That psychological posture, where support is tied to a sense of control, is deeply rooted in how empires behave. So what we're seeing today isn't just a shift in alliances, it's a shift in narrative comfort. Pakistan still fits within a story that America knows how to tell. India increasingly does not, and that should concern you. Because when we start choosing our allies based on who makes us feel morally justified, rather than who represents real democratic alignment, we're not just distorting our foreign policy, we're distorting our moral compass. So here's the final question. Do we care more about what's true, or about what makes us look good in the story we're telling? Because if we lose the ability to tell the truth, even when it's inconvenient, we lose the very foundation of the civilization we claim to defend. Let's try to understand something fundamental about the way modern Western democracies, particularly the United States, make decisions. They are increasingly driven not by vision, not by principle, but by immediacy, by pressure, by the tyranny of the short term. It's a psychological problem as much as a political one, and it's reflected in how alliances are made and abandoned, often with little foresight and even less integrity. The support for Pakistan over India in 2025 isn't just a reflection of geopolitical convenience. It's a manifestation of this deeper failure of long-term thinking. You see it everywhere, in economic policy, in climate action, and here, quite starkly, in foreign affairs. And the problem with short-termism is that it offers immediate returns at the cost of strategic stability. It answers today's questions while quietly planting the seeds of tomorrow's crises. Let's take the case in point. The United States sees in Pakistan a partner that can help manage volatility right now. It sees intelligence channels, access to Afghanistan, counterterrorism cooperation, all valuable tools to plug into quickly. Pakistan is already entangled in the machinery. The system knows how to work with them. It's familiar, and in the short term, that familiarity creates a kind of deceptive comfort. But here's the deeper question. What does this short-term reliance cost in the long term? India is a civilization state. It's not just a nation with GDP growth or a billion-person market. It's an ancient structure waking up to modern power, and it wants something the West once believed in for itself: autonomy, self-determination, cultural pride without apology. But instead of seeing this as an opportunity for meaningful alignment, the West, wrapped in its own reactive logic, pulls away. It backs the familiar over the future. This is what strategic short-termism does. It chooses the tool that's already in hand, even if it's rusted, over the tool that will build something lasting if only you'd invest in it. Pakistan is the rusted tool. It's useful now, but it's structurally unstable. Its democracy is fragile, its military holds disproportionate influence, and its relationship with radical elements is, at best, ambiguous. Betting on that structure, because it's easier today, is like building a home on shifting sand. India, by contrast, is a work in progress. It's messy, loud, often politically turbulent, but it is building something rooted in deep identity, growing prosperity, and a desire to be seen, not as someone's project, but as someone's partner. That's a harder relationship, yes. It requires humility, it requires patience, but it's also where the future lies, and here's the real psychological insight. Short-term thinking is driven by fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of discomfort, fear of losing control. And fear is a terrible guide. It narrows vision, distorts priorities, and breeds alliances built on dependency instead of trust. We see it in families, we see it in individuals, and we see it in global politics. So, when the West chooses Pakistan over India, not because it's the better fit, but because it's the easier fix, it's enacting a pattern of avoidance. Avoidance of hard choices, of deeper engagement, of long-term responsibility. And the tragedy is that the costs of avoidance always come due. They're just deferred. You can't build a meaningful future by only solving the problems of the present. You have to ask, what kind of world are we preparing for, and who do we want standing beside us when we get there? And if we continue to trade long-term vision for short-term comfort, we'll find ourselves surrounded by allies who serve our needs today and betray them tomorrow. So I'll leave you with this. Every time we prioritize what's expedient over what's meaningful, we not only corrupt our strategy, we betray our own potential. And that's a betrayal we can't afford.